Andrew is the founding director of the New Voices Fellowship at the Aspen Institute, and prior to this he spent more than 20 years as a correspondent with Reuters, including some time in Southern Africa as bureau chief during the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and then he spent more than 3 years traveling the world with US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton as Reuters' US diplomatic correspondent. He was also a Neiman Global Health Fellow at Harvard University. So, Andrew, thanks. You can tell us a bit more about the Aspen New Voices Fellowship.
Okay, do you want us to speak from this?
Yeah, that's fine. Otherwise, you can just grab a mic. Yeah.
Either way. Why don't I just start here and then I'll. Sorry. Okay, that's going to work? No? Yeah.
Put it up.
All right, well, communication starts with the equipment, right?
No species.
That's all right. It's a very complicated microphone. Tell you what,
Why don't you just lift it up?
Yeah.
Just lift it up.
Okay. All right. Hey, that was easy enough. Well, thank you, Brett. Brett told us that this was going to be a story format, so I hope you'll forgive me if I start with a story. And if you listen to the people who know stories, they tell you that the best stories are about yourself. So I'm going to tell you a story about me, just to get things going, and then tell you a little bit about New Voices. The story is this: about a little bit under 20 years ago, I was in Southern Africa as the Reuters correspondent. It was sort of a slow time for news. I mean, apartheid had fallen, the wars of liberation had essentially been won, and so it was fairly quiet. But there was this sort of drumbeat of a news story happening underground, which was the HIV/AIDS epidemic. I'd been there for a few years. I covered some of that sort of HIV-related news. And I felt like I knew my region and I knew my story, and I was pretty confident that I could sort of report this. In 2002, President George Bush went to Southern Africa, and as news organizations tend to do when a big guy comes through, you want to write a curtain raiser. What's the president going to talk about when he visits? And so for us, clearly, the idea was going to be he's going to talk about HIV/AIDS. So how do you write a curtain raiser about that? You go out to the worst affected communities, which at that point were in Swaziland, and you write about what they're experiencing. So I got myself in a car and I went up to Swaziland, and I found a local NGO who helped me kind of find some folks who are off the beaten track, doing some interviews with them about what was going on. And I remember one instance very, very clearly where we went in to talk to a woman. She was in a very sort of bare bones, thatched house. She had a few kids running around. She was extremely sick and very poor, clearly. And I went in with my questions, and she was trying to sort the baby out, and she had her pot cooking, and the people who were technically there left me alone with her, with a translator. So I sat down and I asked my questions. How are you? How do you feel? It had been established that she was infected with HIV. And then finally, what would you say to President George Bush if you had the chance? And the woman fixed me with such a withering stare that clearly this question was sort of out of her orbit. It wasn't matching. She didn't have anything to say to George Bush. She hardly had anything to say to me. And the realities of her lived experience with HIV/AIDS and the sort of construct that I was putting on it as a news reporter were completely different. I went back to the office. I thought, okay, I've got to call experts. I flipped my Rolodex. I called my experts at the Harvard School of Public Health, 9,000 miles away, and got my context. And when I hung up the phone, I thought, there's something really wrong with this. This is a classic foreign correspondent move where you have your local sort of victim and your Harvard School of Public Health expert. And I knew that we were missing, in that space in between, we were missing the real story. What was going on? Why was it so bad? How were people not only dying from it, but living through it? And none of these were stories that I was telling, or for the most part, were my colleagues telling. So it's from that New Voices came about. New Voices is a media training program which exists to help experts from developing countries tell their stories and talk about their priorities to a wider public audience. I'll be honest, it started very much as a communications program. Communications and the art of leadership, leadership and the art of communications. We thought we were basically a training program. This is how you write an op-ed. This is how you pitch it to an editor. This is how you do a Moth talk. We have a partnership with the Moth. This is how you do a TED talk. Very sort of technical sort of things you can teach. But along the way, we realized that a big part of this was leadership that we weren't addressing, and that people who haven't had that sort of been, I don't want to say given a place, because they should have a place, but who haven't had access to the media in the same way, don't feel empowered to tell their stories in the way that others do. So we've had to sort of reverse engineer leadership into our communication work. Why is what you have to say important? Why not only are you the person to tell the rest of us about maternal health in Africa, but you have sort of an obligation. We need that information. This isn't just a nice to have. This isn't just a diversity exercise. This is real information on the ground that these folks have that we're not getting otherwise. So that's sort of what New Voices does. As I said, we have training partnerships with the Moth, with TED in TEDx in Washington, D.C. and in Joburg. We do work with CNBC Africa for television training. We have a very strong mentorship program. Most of the work is done one-on-one with journalist mentors and our fellows over the course of a year. It's a non-resident fellowship, but we work them hard. And we've got some good, if you're interested in metrics, we've got a few. We've had, over the 6 years now, we've had 100 fellows this year, 27 countries, 2,600 media hits overall. Last year, our 2017 class, which is 20 people, produced 195 op-eds, which is a pretty good per capita output. And our alumni, more interestingly, the alumni who are out of the program, but with whom we still are working, they produced 163 op-eds. So that's really our main thing, is are they out there continuing to get their points across, continuing to act as communicators and as experts. There have been other things that have happened because of that. People have got new jobs, their projects have got new funding. Sometimes policies have changed because of op-eds and because of the work that our fellows have done to get their points across. So what we try to show them is that not only do they have an obligation to tell the rest of us, but they need to be, that their input can actually affect the way policy works. We're continuing now. Our question now is how do we build this into a community of purpose where people from different development sectors all work together as a sort of communications block to talk to people like the people who are working in the SDGs or U.S. Department of State or USAID. How do we coordinate these folks together from their many disparate backgrounds?
Thanks, Andrew. So next person is Elsa Marie De Silva, and she's a former Aspen New Voices Fellow and founder and CEO of the Red Dot Foundation, or Safe City, which is a platform that documents sexual harassment and abuse in public spaces. Now, under Elsa's guidance, that has become the largest crowd map on the issue of sexual harassment and abuse in public spaces in India, Kenya, Cameroon, Nigeria, and Nepal. In addition to being a former Aspen New Voices Fellow, she's a 2017 Stanford Draper Hill Summer School Fellow, Chevening Gurukul Fellow at Oxford University, a Rotary Peace Fellow, and 2014 Vital Voices Lead Fellow, and alumna of the Swedish Institute. And she's also participating in the Global Entrepreneurship Summit. So Elsa, welcome. Thank you very much. And to hear your experience.
Thank you. Leadership is living your purpose and telling others why, so that they may be inspired to join your movement. I didn't really understand the full meaning of it till a few years ago. In December 2012, a young woman was gang raped on a bus in Delhi, and she died of her brutal injuries. The incident was extremely vicious, and for that reason, for the first time, during everyday conversations in India, people started to share their own personal experiences of sexual violence in public spaces. It lifted the lid on an otherwise taboo topic and brought people out onto the streets to protest the indignity of the crime. At the time, I was working in the aviation industry as Vice President Network Planning. I've been in the sector for close to 20 years, and I was in charge for planning the route network of more than 500 daily flights. And whilst the work was challenging, it was not personally fulfilling, and I was looking for my purpose in the world. The incident in Delhi caused me to reflect on my own incidences and experiences of sexual violence on public transportation, on the sidewalks, and other places, experiences which I had not shared before. And I started to talk to other women about theirs, and I was shocked at how normal and common it was. And so I decided to quit my job and use my skills to end violence against women and girls. And although I didn't have any prior experience working on women's rights and no background in the development sector, I took the plunge and I co-founded Safe City. It is a crowd map for sexual violence in public spaces where we encourage people to anonymously share their stories, and these are then collated as location-based trends visualized on a map as hotspots. And what happened clearly, encouraged me, because like I was enraged, there were others too. And so the stories started to pour in. And these stories ranged from luring to verbal harassment to stalking and groping and other physical forms of sexual violence. But these are not just stories alone, they are actually advocacy tools, because we use the online data that women and girls share to identify factors that lead to behavior that cause such violence and help us think through strategies for solutions. We partner with NGOs based in communities, citizen and student groups, to actually raise awareness on the issue and encourage people to break their silence. And thus far, we have collated over 11,000 stories, not only from India, but also through partners in Kenya, Nepal, Cameroon, Nigeria, and many other countries. We have used the data to successfully mobilize communities and thus far have engaged over 400,000 citizens, police, municipal authorities, transportation authorities, not only in India but also abroad. And from the very start, storytelling has been a critical component of Safe City. It is these individual stories that move people to act, and the collective stories that pressure stakeholders to pay attention and do something. It is these stories that have inspired people to join our movement as volunteers, donors, partners, and even team members. But you cannot create a movement as a leader if you are not willing to share your own story and tell it effectively. I was very fortunate that at the start of my journey with Safe City, I was selected to be an Aspen New Voices Fellow, where I was taught the art of storytelling. And when I first had to share my own story, my own experience of being groped on a train as a 13-year-old, and I had to share it in a public forum, it was very difficult. It was extremely difficult. But I had to do it to connect with my audience, to build their trust, and to encourage them to follow my lead in breaking the silence. And now, after every public event, I have women coming up to me telling me their story with tears in their eyes. And more than once, I've had the privilege of hugging someone while she sobbed and told me her secret experience. I feel a great sense of responsibility to write my opinions in articles, blog posts, on social media. And over the years, I have created a following of people who reach out to me for advice, help, guidance, and even inspiration. Further, by being able to communicate about our work effectively through storytelling, and for our success in raising the voices of the people we serve and convincing authorities to incorporate changes in existing policies, we have been recognized as a thought leader in this space. We have been invited to speak at several important fora, UN Women, UN Habitat, World Bank, NDI, amongst others, and have received awards from various global entities. Personally, I know I'm making a difference, and I feel the work has been worth it, especially when a young girl tells me she can confidently return back to school, or a young woman says she's less afraid accessing a public space when it turns dark, or a young man becomes an advocate for change amongst his own peers. But on a daily basis, I never forget that I was inspired into action by the story of the death of a young woman. And I hope by living my purpose, I can inspire others to join my movement in ending violence against women and girls. Thank you.
Thanks, also, that was really powerful. So moving on to Joseph Rellin, who's a creative strategist and has a long history working with and in racial justice and economic justice organizations. So before his current work as the director of the ReFrame Mentorship, he was a strategic communications consultant for foundations and progressive organizations. He got his start as communications coordinator at Miami Workers Center, where he spent years pounding out press releases in a windowless back room. He went on to be a founding staff member at the Florida New Majority, where he was let out of his stuffy room, and he worked across the state overseeing program strategy. So once he left Miami, he traveled the country as communications director with Caring Across Generations, and he saw a severe lack in local and regional capacity and strategic acumen when it came to communications. So in 2014, he founded the ReFrame Mentorship along with Jen Soriano with a focus on developing the next generation of strategic communications across social justice movements.
Thank you. Hey everybody, how's everyone doing? Yeah, I'm going to sit like you all. So who here does communications for most of their waking hours? Great. Okay, so I like to know my audience because I'm a communicator. So my story starts with coffee. So I love coffee, like any good strategic communicator loves coffee. Getting up before everybody else to get the press release out for whatever's happening that day. Okay? I love the way it smells. I love the way it tastes. I love it so much I have a tattoo of a coffee cup somewhere on my body. Sometimes I go to sleep at night thinking of my first cup of coffee that I will get the next day. It's love. But what I really love coffee for is the ability for me to sit down with other people who may not be like me and have a cup of coffee and have a conversation. So in 2005, at the ripe old age of 25, I went to Miami for an internship at the Miami Workers Center. And I was a very skinny, vegan, bicycle messenger, punk rock kid from New York City. And I went into the leadership meeting for the first day of our internship, and it was run by older black women from across the South who ended up living in Miami. And in that moment, I had a very deep clarity of a clear experience of dislocation and understanding of like, oh man, I am a northern carpetbagger coming in with my newfangled ideas, and I'm going to help people, right? Like I was very aware of the perception. And just as I was settling into some deep discomfort of trespassing, Miss Mary Alice Wadley walked up to me, about this tall, with gray curly hair, and she said to me, "Can you grab me a cup of coffee?" And I was like, yes, I'm in. And that really started the work that I did, and I was in Miami for about 7 years. And through Miss Mary Alice Wadley, I met Miss Mary Nesbitt. And Miss Mary Nesbitt had spent 20 years living in a public housing complex called Scott Carver Homes, which several years before I got to Miami was torn down using federal funding. Using federal funding to tear down public housing, right? We all understand this story. And Miss Mary Nesbitt had lived there for 20 years, and she was a leader on the ground and fighting back to get her home rebuilt. And by the time I met her, she was blind from diabetes, and she had a bunch of health problems, but no matter how long she spent in the hospital, the first place she came when she got out was the Miami Workers Center office to whatever meeting was happening to strategize to get her home back. And one day, I sat down with Miss Mary Nesbitt, because I'd worked there for several years, and we wrote an op-ed together. And so when I say we wrote an op-ed together, she spoke, and then I wrote it down, and then it got published, right? And so she wrote the op-ed, I was the pen, or the computer. And she knew we were writing an op-ed, she knew we were going to try and get it published. It was a part of our strategy. She had helped develop the strategy as a part of a leadership team, all of this. But 2 weeks later, I got a call from Miss Mary Nesbitt, and she was crying. And my first thought was like, oh no, someone died, right? Like, what's happening? Because I'm Irish. And that's when people call from Ireland. So we figured out, I figured out quickly that she was crying because her neighbor had come to her house with the paper and read her the op-ed that she had written. And she had already been a leader. She'd been a leader in a union. She was a community leader in the organization. She had stared down commissioners. She had led sleep-ins on the lawns of the county commission. But it was this publication and hearing someone read back her words and her story that allowed her to transform her own understanding of herself. It was a transformational moment of leadership. And it was through the kind of channel of communications. And another piece of the story that I think is really interesting is, like, I feel like we've all been in the room, right, where we're trying to figure out the perfect message or the perfect strategy that's going to finally knock down the dominant narratives that are shaping the issues we're working on, right? Like, if we could just get the right word, racism will go away. I'm going to give you all my email. I want to hear your words later. The reality is, so here we are fighting around public housing, and Miss Mary Nesbitt, who lived in public housing for 20 years, finished her op-ed with the line of, right, so we're fighting against racism, we're fighting around gender, we're fighting against some really gross stereotypes. And she ends it with the line of, I haven't hung up the curtains in my new home yet because it's not my home. Which did more to challenge the dominant narrative about public housing and who lived there and what it was, right, than any other thing that the smart people sitting in a room could have figured out. And that was also a really important lesson for me. So years later, as the bio said, I helped start the ReFrame Mentorship. It is a 6-month strategic communications mentorship program. So similar, I think, to Aspen, we had the idea that we're gonna train people in strategy, and then we're gonna talk about it from a communication standpoint, and that's what we're gonna do. And then we discovered that we're training people in realizing their own leadership, so that, sure, they're gonna have to write their press release, but they're gonna be able to argue within their organization that this is the correct action in this moment to advance what we are trying to do. And that's not only based on a deep strategic analysis, it's also based on a lived reality of the people we work with. So the ReFrame Mentorship is a 6-month strategic communications mentorship program. Our core mission is to develop the next generation of strategic communicators. We're going to do it ourselves. I'll give you my bank account routing number. And the second is to support organizations, so social justice organizations, to integrate communications as a core strategy. Because based under all of this work is the assumption that communications, when done correctly to move narratives, will create space for us to win. I've been told I have 1 minute. So I think, just real quick, in all of this stuff, coming back to also who is in the room, like who's in that smart room that gets to develop the messaging, we are very much focused on the next generation not looking a lot more like me. And so over the last 3 years, we're headed into our 4th cohort in 2 weeks. The majority of our graduates have been women and people of color. And the metrics are a little bit tougher because they're out leading the campaigns, right? So they are supporting the Miss Nesbitts that write those op-eds. They are supporting the EDs to get on, TV, et cetera, et cetera. And they're also making the right strategic calls in the right moments, which are a bit harder to measure until you look back at it. And so we see that we're going to see, what we say to each other all the time is we'll see results in 10 years. But it takes kind of a steel gut to know that you're going to have those results in 10 years and not tomorrow. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Joseph. So our final speaker is Kimberly Freeman Brown, who's Programming Co-Director for the ReFrame Mentorship. She's also President of KFD Consulting, an organizational development and strategic communications consulting firm. She has particular expertise in racial and gender equity and inclusion, communication strategy, leadership development, and organizational development. Before that, she served as Executive Director of American Rights at Work, which under her leadership merged with Jobs and Justice in 2012. Jobs with Justice. She's the author of I Dream Detroit, The Voice and Vision of Women of Color on Detroit's Future, and Still I Rise, Black Women, Labor Leaders' Voices, Power and Promise. Kimberly is an outspoken advocate for racial and gender justice and labor rights, and has been quoted in a range of news outlets, had editorials published, and television channels. She's also an advisor on racial equity, inclusion, leadership at the Center for Popular Democracy, and an affiliate coach with Rockford Leadership Institute, and she serves on the board of directors of the Grassroots Policy Project. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Brett. What a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you for being here. One of the worst things that you can do to folks who train people to do communications and who've done communications, I'm sure you all will identify this, is to ask them to speak publicly in front of people. So I just appreciate you all giving us the grace of knowing how hard this can be for us. And I just want to say thank you to the fellow panelists. I just was so enthralled with your stories, so thank you for sharing them. So I have one to share as well. And it goes a little something like this. What you see before you is basically a microphone, a human microphone. And on some days, and on the best days, more like a bullhorn. And my job with ReFrame, with my partner here, my brother from another mother, Joseph, and our amazing team at ReFrame, is to make more human microphones and more amplifiers of those who are affected by some of the salient social issues that they work on, amplifying their voices and positioning them as thought leaders. And you can see why in hearing Elsa's story, why that's so important and how powerful it is. And how I got to that place goes a little something like this. I was a community organizer for a number of years, right out of college. I worked for Marian Wright Edelman and the Children's Defense Fund, training young African-American college-age students to start freedom schools across the country. And I ran one in Washington, D.C., just like literally in the shadows of the nation's capital, in one of the worst public housing projects in D.C. for about 3 years. I ran the program. And I got burnt out. It was hard work. It was painful to see what folks that looked like me, who lived so close to the seat of global power, what they were suffering from. So I got burnt out, and a former professor of mine at the University of Maryland when I went to school was doing a project with the Smithsonian Institution. She asked me to come and be her research assistant for a little while. So I said, sure, I'll do that and recharge my battery. They actually needed a community organizer because they were doing a project that looked at how the influx of Afro-Latino and Caribbean folks into Washington had redefined what it meant to be black in Washington, D.C., a city that was predominantly black. And they didn't know how to do it. They were showing up with their government ID badges, knocking on people's doors, asking them to tell their stories, and that wasn't working very well. And so I started as a community organizer, helping them engage the community in telling their stories. And I lived in Washington in the area for a while, but it was something about transitioning out of organizing into working at the Smithsonian where I had like an Oprah aha moment. I was standing on the National Mall one day and I noticed that the Capitol building, the seat of power in our nation, was on the same piece of land that was surrounded by cultural institutions, by museums. And I was like, wow, what's the relationship between cultural institutions where people's stories are told and the seat of power where policy is made? And I realized that there was a relationship between whose story got told, how it got told, and public policy. And I said, okay, this is what I really want to do. This is my purpose. I've been told that I could talk pretty, that I could convince people to do things that they might not want to do. But I realized that there weren't very many people like me in the spaces that got to interpret meaning and assign meaning to the salient social issues that were affecting us, nor to the policies that were being created around those issues. And so I purposed myself and my leadership to be a microphone, to really create space for people who were most affected by those issues to interpret and assign meaning to the stories that we were reading in the paper. And for years, I haven't done communications. Like as Brett mentioned, I've moved into a space of doing more organizational development, but ReFrame has given me the ability to connect my purpose back to communications. And so our approach is to really, on a leadership level, do the basic training that Andrew, you talked about as like a beginning, but also to recognize that we want to make more microphones. We want to make more human amplifiers. And so we really lean into encouraging and cultivating our mentees' commitment to doing that work. And there are a couple different ways that we do that. One is, by really stoking the fire of getting them to ask or be aware of whose narrative gets to shape the stories that are told and how they're told. And that begins with them and stepping into their leadership to be that person. And it also encourages them to create other opportunities for folks that they work with in their different fields to be those people as well. And leadership, when you're doing that, when you're really breaking down barriers around that, really is about how you develop the courage, the confidence, and the skill to manage up, to manage down, to manage within your organizations and without, and to manage to your left and to your right, to be able to convince people to do things differently when there is nothing that would otherwise encourage them to do so. And I think the last thing I will say about the impact that I think we're having, that I can see, I don't think we have to wait 10 years, Joseph, is that Joseph and I have done communications for now more decades than we care to admit. And what we're seeing when we started in communications, is a very competitive field. To get to someone like Andrew, like if I had a relationship with Andrew back in the day, I wasn't going to share it with Joseph, right? But what we're seeing, just by having new voices with new ways of doing things in the world, we're breaking down that competitive form of communications and developing a more collaborative one. And the other thing that I think that we're seeing is that new voices, the diversifying the field of communications, means that there are new ways of communicating. People are creating their own mediums of telling their stories. They're owning the stories in the way that Elsa talked about, in ways that really, when you externalize your story, there's something powerful about that makes you not only a communicator but a leader. So those are some of the things that we're playing with and some of the impact that I think we're seeing at ReFrame that we're excited about seeing more of.
Thank you very much. And I think we've had really 4 great, really interesting and powerful speakers. And you'll have a chance to ask some questions of them in a bit. But we first wanted to give you a chance also to chat with one another and meet some people in the room. So, as I said, there's some kind of slips on your chair with some suggested questions. So if you could turn and kind of create a group of 4 or 5 people around you and spend 10 minutes just, thinking about this